$6. That's half the regular cost. Plus the New Yorker tote bag. You'll get home delivery of the print edition each week, along with unlimited access to NewYorker.com, which includes 10 to 15 exclusive site-only stories every day. Every day. This deal also includes app access, online archives dating back to 1925. I'd like to actually do that. Sort of just browse that stuff. Crossword puzzles and more. Get 12 weeks of the New Yorker for just $6, plus an exclusive tote at NewYorker.com/majority. You will save 50% when you enter the code majority at checkout. NewYorker.com/majority. Enter the code majority at checkout. Huge savings on a great periodical. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking to Mike Konczal. He's the director of progressive thought at the Roosevelt Institute. Right back after this. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. On the phone, Mike Konczal. He is the director of progressive thought at the Roosevelt Institute. I've been reading a lot of your pieces, Mike, and welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back on.
In March, you at the Roosevelt Institute came out with a report, a forward-thinking policy response to the coronavirus recession, and you were writing in another piece that you wrote, I guess now 2 weeks ago, that the pace in which the problem that we are facing economically was moving so quickly that your imagination on some level had trouble keeping up with it. And just give me a sense of like where we are now in the way that you view what's going to happen. I mean, on some level, I feel like I remember once playing Frisbee, and I was running as a kid, and I was running backwards and banged into a tree, and I was in such a state of shock that I froze there before I crumpled on the ground. And I feel like we're in that moment where we like banged into the tree and we're just sort of stunned and we're about to crumple. Is that your sense in terms of the economics of this?
Yeah, I think in the same way, everyone, on March 10th, maybe didn't quite understand how life-changing the COVID crisis would be. The same exact thing was true of economists who are not epidemiologists and who do not have a good sense of how severe this would get. So, I wrote about in March 10th, there was maybe talk about a $500 billion stimulus. $1 trillion stimulus seemed very exaggerated. A week later, March 17th, maybe talking about a $1 trillion stimulus was the normal. And then a week and a half ago, we passed a $2 trillion, a little over a $2 trillion stimulus. And it's very likely there'll be another expansion done very quickly. So the scope of what's changing is expanded quite rapidly, as well as the worry that we are facing a planned depression happening right now, and a lot of uncertainty about how quickly and if we'll recover.
What are the sort of when you sit down to contemplate the stimulus package, let's say phase 3, for instance, what are the principles that you're operating on? Like, what is the I guess, I understand that we're in triage, right? As opposed to sort of like long-term, but what are the operative principles for triage in this situation?
Right. So I think the metaphor a lot of people use, and I think it's useful, is freezing the economy, which is we understand that large parts of the economy, but not all parts, need to stop for the next, as of a month ago, the next 2 to 3 months, and we're not quite sure when it'll be over. But we needed to freeze the economy, which meant keeping people whole, making sure people could pay their rent, or making sure that they weren't overwhelmed by current bills, as well as keeping our economic relationships in place. So businesses that might collapse, as most small businesses only have about a week or two of liquid funds, businesses that might collapse if they have no customers for 2 months, finding ways to get them the resources they need to ensure that they'll still be there on the other side. Because I think the big worry, the thing that would turn this into a very weird kind of temporary recession versus a full-blown depression, is that if all these businesses and all these economic relationships and all these employment contracts suddenly just disappear into nothingness, you can't just reconstruct that on the fly. So that's why there's been a huge set of understanding about why we need to interject forcibly into getting everyday people money, getting unemployed people unemployment insurance so that they can go on furlough, and getting small and medium-sized businesses a financial backstop so that they can keep their businesses alive during this recovery, or during this quarantine.
It seems to me, and I want to get your assessment on this, that the challenge to the United States in this regard is far greater than almost maybe any industrialized nation, because we don't have an apparatus to provide support to people. I mean, I think that's basically, I mean, you're writing about that, I guess, in this piece about our system is hostile to real reform. But even we don't have the automatic stabilizers. We don't have we don't have the cups. Never mind, the question as to whether we should fill them up. We don't have the cups, essentially, that are already built like they are in most countries.
Absolutely. And you compound that with the fact that we are a very large country, and we are also a federalist country, which is that a lot of economic decision-making takes place at the city or state level. It's been a real disaster. So if you look at countries that were successful in freezing their economies, you have a place like Denmark, which has very strong labor unions. And in a very real sense, labor, capital, and the government, the state, can sit down and negotiate how they're going to freeze the economy, how much payrolls might go down, how much pay cuts might happen, how much the federal government will pay, and so on, and how much the corporations will pay. There's no mechanism here, particularly in the private sector. Labor has been decimated since 1980. So it's not like you can sit down with labor unions and dictate how we're going to make sure that everyone doesn't have to work for 3 months and then how we pick it back up. On purpose, and not just in red states, unemployment insurance has not been expanded. If anything, it's contracted quite a bit in the last decade or two. And so putting millions more people in a short notice, like within weeks, on unemployment, there's just not the infrastructure to do it. And in addition, so many of our jobs have become precariously non-employment contracts. So they're like, contractors, or you work for a app where you're a contractor of the app, though in a real way you're an employee of the app. You don't get unemployment insurance. So getting people unemployment insurance, even though we allocated hundreds of billions of dollars to quickly get it out the door, there's a real choke point in how atrophied our public systems have become under the last several decades. The same thing with small businesses. We essentially are paying banks to give money to businesses. We can give money to businesses, these small and medium-sized businesses. It's not like rocket science, but the only interface we have to do it rapidly is through the private banking system, and we essentially have to give them a lot of money to do it. So It's a really messed up system for doing quick change that's effective and helping people. And, in the same way, a lot of people are going to struggle to get the unemployment, and they should apply. And I'm not trying to discourage anyone at all from doing it. It's going to be much more of a struggle than if we were a country that took these things seriously.
All right. And I just want to go into a little bit more detail in those two categories. And then we'll talk about the third sort of tranche, if you will, of, I guess there's more than three, but in terms of the private sector, in terms of the unemployment, I know that, I've been reading some pieces out of Florida that Rick Scott basically jerry-rigged the system as a way of driving down unemployment numbers, right? Just numbers, not actually unemployed people, but numbers. And that has left the whole system in shambles. Just give us a sense of what that actually means in practice.
It means that in normal recessions, where the unemployment that we are having would normally take 6 months to essentially come online or become fully unemployed. So the Great Recession, which was pretty traumatic, and everyone listening probably remembers, or at least understood that, unemployment went to 10%, but that took actually about 6 months. Here we had 10% unemployment in probably about 2 weeks. We'll know more with time, but probably within about 2 weeks. So these systems, which are designed not to discourage people from using them. You're going to read a lot about how there's funny programming languages, or things are really dusty or haven't been updated in years. But the real thing is not really technological. It's political. People do not want these systems to work because they don't want to pay people. They don't want to expand the usage of it. They'd rather put the money to other things, especially in red states, things like corporate tax cuts or large-scale prisons. And as such, it's just hard for people to get them. They're going to have to work a lot harder, which means people might get discouraged from doing it, which means they won't have the money to stay on unemployment insurance, which means that there'll be less spending in the economy, and it'll have a real knock-on effect that harms us later.
So, it basically just comes down to, a more sophisticated version of you got to fill this out in triplicate. And then you got to file one with, in this office, and then one in that office. And then you've got to get stamps on those and then return them, and then send a self-addressed envelope. But the flag, the stamp needs to be, a bicentennial stamp. And you can find those on, it's that type of thing, right? It's just putting up all these roadblocks to making it harder to actually execute, and hoping that people just give up in frustration.
Yeah, and so there's obviously the roadblocks that were put in place. Same way there's voting restrictions that have been implemented over the last decade or two that we're now going to see hit the COVID crisis. It's the same thing with basic economic security. We've made it so it's legally easier for employers to deny workers their employment rights, like unemployment insurance. And the states themselves have discouraged these programs from staying updated or even actively dismantling them. And now we have a real crisis where people need them, and it's going to really harm people. And even when there's not necessarily, even other things, one thing we haven't mentioned is sending checks to everyday people. Every adult, every adult more or less gets a $1,200 check. Every child a $600 check. There's really harsh restrictions if you're not a citizen. And if you make over $100,000, it starts to get clawed back. But make sure to be aware of that. But the problem is there's not an actual list of everyone's name and address and checking account. So you can't actually just send people checks quickly. The most approximate thing we used to have for this, which was aid to families with dependent children, was eliminated during welfare reform by Bill Clinton and Republicans in the 1990s. So the obvious mechanism we have for just getting poorer families with children checks doesn't exist anymore. So now everyone's running around trying to figure out how to do this through the tax code. There's a lot of people who don't file, who won't be aware of this. These checks might take months to get to some people when we really need them there this week to make rent that was due on the 1st.
Physically, they can't.
These systems have just been weakened in such a way that makes it really hard to do these policies.
Physically, they can't even print more than 20 million a week. And on the back of, an envelope, I'm not great at math, but that sounds to me like less than 10% of the people in the country who are due a check, essentially. And if they can only do 10% per week, people can figure it out. It takes 10 weeks to get everybody a check. All right. So let's also talk about this, the SBA, the loans. I mean, those loans seem like a good idea. The problem, like you say, is there's no apparatus.